Welcome to the Escape and Empower podcast. Escape from the corporate rat race to empowered franchise ownership. Are you ready to take control of your destiny, follow your dreams, and live life on your own terms? Join our hosts, Dave and Pete, for insights on how to break free from the corporate grind, ditch the 9-to-5, and step into empowered franchise ownership.
Good morning and welcome to the Escape and the Empower podcast. My name is Pete Gilfillan and I'm here with my podcast partner, Dave Greenberg. Good morning, Dave.
Pete, what is happening on this beautiful morning?
Oh, I am super excited. You know, I thought we would address one of the questions we always get, right? And it's one that, it's a big one. And it is a question that I thought we'd spend some time today. And it is this. How engaged do you have to be as a franchise owner? How much time do you have to put into a franchise?
It's an awesome question because, there's no free ride in this world. What you always need to do in the entrepreneurial way is just roll up your sleeves and get to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we talk about this, there's different levels of engagement when people invest in a franchise. And so we're going to talk more about the executive model today. So when we speak about franchising and being engaged, so one level is the artisan, and that's where somebody is really just buying themselves a job, right? If it's a lawn fertilizing business, they want to be the one fertilizing lawns or spraying for mosquitoes, and they get in their truck and they go spray the next one, right? So they're just creating a job for themselves. We're not going to talk about that today. So we're going to talk about the executive model. In most of our candidates, the executives, senior level executives we work with are interested in that executive model. The idea behind it is that they want to work on the business, not in the business, right? So they don't want to be the one spraying lawns. They don't want to be making sub sandwiches. They want to be leading the organization. So I thought we would talk a little bit about the pros and cons in regards to being involved in it full-time or semi-absentee, or what we call part-time.
I love it. Pete, if my memory doesn't fail me, it was 11 years ago that you asked me that same question when I was your candidate in the franchise investigation process, or actually it was before then when we were doing our consultation. You and Laurie and I were having this discussion, and one of your key questions is, Dave, do you want to work on it? Or do you want to work in it? And I just love that question because we both sweated it out with Ford Motor Company and in our other corporate roles, working in it every day and working on it. I was like, okay, what the heck does that mean?
Absolutely. And it's really kind of comes down to is you're not the person doing whatever the business does.
Right.
So let's describe the executive model. And the idea behind it is we want to leverage our experience and our capital into a business that gives us a good return. Now, we'll always be involved, but we want to work on it, not in it, right? So that means that if it's a lawn fertilizing business, we're not fertilizing lawns, we're managing the manager, planning the marketing, right?
Yeah.
If it's a sub shop, we may know how they make subs, but we're not making subs. We're managing manager planning, marketing, all that kind of stuff, driving the business, right? So, and over time, we expect this business to grow, to build something large, open up multiple locations in multiple territories. So That's the executive model. Now, when we talk about the executive model, there is different levels of engagement, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So there is the executive model full-time. So although you're not spraying lawns, although you're not making sub sandwiches, you're involved in the business 40 or 50 hours a week, managing manager, planning the marketing, right? So executive model full-time. The other side of the spectrum is executive model semi-absentee. This idea that you can maybe keep your corporate job, keep your corporate income, and have the franchise on the side. Put a manager in place, watch over that manager once it's established, 15 or 20 hours a week. You don't have to be involved in it every day, but you need to be minding your business. Executive model semi-absentee, or what we call part-time. So we're going to talk about executive model full-time and semi-absentee. So let's first start with the full-time engagement. And you know this one, I know this one. The executive model full-time. Let's talk about some of the pros. So I'm involved, I invest in this franchise, and I am leading the business 40, 50 hours a week. So what would be one great example or a pro to the executive model full-time?
Well, I guess I think of those managers or those candidates that say, I'm a hands-on manager. I'm like, well, what the hell does that mean? Which one? And, when you get to it, they want control. And full-time involvement gives you that control. You're going to be managing the daily operations. You're going to make sure the managers deliver on customer service or the day-to-day activities. And you're going to be on the front line of decision making. And at some point, you may be more effective at problem solving because it's speed to resolving a problem as an entrepreneur, which frankly is just up to you, which is a great thing. So greater control, I think, is something people will benefit from if that's their gig in an executive full-time involvement.
Sure, and I think when you're involved in it and overseeing it full-time, there also is a greater connection to the team, right? You get to know the people. You're not just working through a manager, you are kind of watching over the organization, and that allows you to build those connections. And I think in today's world, that's a pretty important thing, is that connection to your team members.
I love it because, now I think you're talking a little bit about workplace culture and retention, which is so important in today's labor market. Hire slow and fire fast, but when you find the right person, you want to have a real strong relationship, because your relationship with employees, their satisfaction as an employee will ultimately lead to the satisfaction with the culture that you've put in place, and they'll drive to make customers happy.
And I think in today's world with this tight labor, it's not about the dollars. Yes, we have to pay people fairly, but people want to be part of something. They want to be part of a cause to help build this. And it could be something as simple as restoration, right? They have to get the water out of my house. That's a cause. That's not a simple job, getting water out, putting fans down. But the idea is if they're helping families get back into their house after they've had a big event, a tragic event, right? Bottom line is that it's part of a cause. And so that connection, I think, helps drive that cause of the organization, the impact of others.
Right.
What would be a great pro to executive model full-time?
Well, I love brand. And when you're working to establish consistency in messaging, in making sure you're working to the standards of the brand, consistency and execution is so important. And being full-time, you can ensure all aspects of the business kind of run from those guardrails or guidelines you put on it from a marketing or customer service perspective. And importantly, you need to align with the franchisor's brand guidelines, because you're there to protect their brand and you're there to execute locally, which means you need to protect your brand in the local market. And, maintaining consistency has to have a lot of integrity in it as you work through it.
Yeah, and I think it's about living the brand, right? When you're involved in it 40 or 50 hours a week, you're living that brand. And that's so important as we talk about that consistency and building the awareness and customer satisfaction, all that kind of stuff. So certainly that is. And I think one of the other things that is you can move a little bit faster in regards to solving problems. And you mentioned this earlier, right? Is that when I'm involved in it full time, when we have issues, and as business owners, we have to solve issues. It doesn't matter where the issues come from. Bottom line is our job as an entrepreneur is to solve problems. And when you're involved in it full time, I think you can probably address those issues faster and more efficiently.
Right. When you're running more efficiently, it brings up another one, which is, can you increase your profit potential by being in the business full time? Sometimes it's not what you expect, it's what you inspect. And as you work in the business full time, you're inspected on a daily basis. And active involvement can sometimes really lead to optimization of operations. But you're investing that time to do it. And that active involvement can also, I think, lead to improved customer experience, as we discussed, but ultimately managing costs more effectively, staying close to it, staying on it.
Yeah, and I think the big deal is that when you have a manager, you're paying that manager, call it $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 to be there because you're not there, right? But if you are running it full time, you don't have to pay that manager $50,000 or $60,000. That all drops to your bottom line, or simply put, you're paying yourself. And then also, I do believe sometimes when you have somebody else building your business, they're not going to build it as well as you, right? And you're overseeing them. But the idea is that if you're there full time, you're going to probably build it a little faster. You're going to probably build it a little bit better.
I agree with that.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about then, if we are involved in executive model full time, we're engaged in it 40, 50 hours a week. What would be some of the cons associated with that?
Well, I think it's time. Your time commitment is a requirement. You can't run a full-time business from an executive approach with half-time work. You have to be in it. It's demanding. And you got to be careful because, some of the people that we're talking to are burnt out in the corporate world, and you can get burnt out in the entrepreneurial world as well.
I think without guardrails, you can really kind of get in and it consumes your life. And you have to be able to, as an entrepreneur, be able to sort your time or put yourself in a position where, like, I love working, right? And you do too. And from a standpoint of a business owner, as I'm involved in it full time, I still set up things like, for example, every Tuesday at 5 o'clock, I'm done. Now, it doesn't matter what's happening at 5 o'clock. I shut down my computer and I go on a date with my wife, date night, every Tuesday night. And that's a guardrail for me so that I don't keep working from that standpoint. Or,
right.
I know take Monday mornings off to do your stuff, right? You have to be really careful because the business can become all consuming and then you are, for lack of better terms, consumed or get burnt out. All right, what will be another one?
Well, we're talking about time commitment. Now, we just talked about some examples of our flexibility with our time. And if you're going to be in it 100% of the time, driving that level of commitment, you might be sacrificing some of the flexibility that you were yearning for that you weren't provided in the corporate world. So we're not talking you out of full-time involvement in executive model business, but it's kind of cuts into your flexibility. When you're there, all of a sudden the expectations are you're there full-time.
Well, and I think about if you want to take a long weekend to go see one of your kids in college, for example, right? That gets a little bit harder when you are involved in it 40, 50 hours a week. When you got to manage your place, you feel a little bit more comfortable from the standpoint of leaving for the weekend. Doesn't mean you're not minding your business. You may be, as you're driving to that college football game, you may be checking in with your manager and, at halftime you may be texting and to see how the day is going. But the idea is that you can go to that game. So that is a con. I think the other piece of it is when you're involved in it full time, there's stress associated with that. Bottom line is that you're absorbing all that stress. You don't have a manager absorbing it. You're absorbing all that stress.
Right.
And that can be a con to being involved in it full time.
Right. With these cons, we're not talking anyone out of an entrepreneurial role and a direction that would involve you full time, because you still get all the benefits of being a business owner. You get to work for yourself. You get to make those decisions. You get to feel empowered about driving the business and growth where the wealth creation is for yourself. So, I think through these cons, we're not saying it's a bad thing. We're just saying that's one approach that you could take. And there's some real benefits, and then there's some things that might work the other way.
No, I think that's a great point, is when you talk about this, is that as an entrepreneur, you are in control. And so when we talk about these cons, you can work through anything and certainly get through it. But we're just kind of giving some observations. But absolutely, it's your business. And you and I, we've been in the corporate world, we've escaped the corporate world, and we're now empowered to kind of do our own thing. And that's a wonderful thing, right? You get up in the morning, you don't have a boss, right? You don't have artificial objectives like we're going to get this market share this year. And you're like, well, what resource do we get for that? Oh, you don't get any more resources. We just want that market share. Okay, very good. And then you don't have to sit through senseless meetings and all that kind of stuff. So there are so many great things about being an entrepreneur. We're just kind of laying out some of the pros and cons associated with the engagement level.
Right.
So, as we also talk about being in it full time, right? That allows us, or doesn't allow us, to be involved in other things. Like when we talk about being involved in a franchise full time, that means that I can't have maybe a corporate gig where I'm creating an income, I've got all the benefits, and I've got the franchise on the side, right? So I lose a little bit of that, being able to have multiple different revenue streams.
Absolutely. And that's, if you're doing everything you want to do and it's giving everything you've ever needed and ever wanted, fine. But the opportunity here is to think on a broader scale so you can think about other ventures or diversification as you stabilize operations and start to hover up and look at growth.
So let's talk a little bit about executive model semi-absentee, so the other side of the spectrum. And frankly, a lot of people, this is what they're looking for, because when you have an executive model semi-absentee franchise, again, you have to put 15 or 20 hours a week in it once you get it established. All right, let's be clear, you always have to mind your business. But they're looking at this because the deal is, and it comes down to a simple phrase I tell people. You can own an executive model semi-absentee franchise and choose to work in it full-time, but you can't own an executive model full-time franchise and choose to work in it part-time. So that's why I think a lot of people, they have some flexibility when we talk about engagement if they focus on executive model semi-absentee ownership. So let's talk about some of the pros associated with the executive model semi-absentee. So what would be one? What would be the top one you think of?
Well, Pete, I'm living this, and I lived it thanks to you. And it was all about working on the business and not in the business. The number one thing that I craved as I moved from the corporate world into becoming an entrepreneur was a better work-life balance. I wanted to have more flexibility in my personal life. I wanted to get more connected with my family commitments. I had some hobbies I wanted to pursue. And while I enjoy a good life, taking a break once in a while and not worrying about the email stress when I got back, when I enjoyed a little bit of a vacation or break or however it was, work-life balance was just at the top for me.
No question about it. And same thing for me. I mean, you think about the corporate side of it, and we missed a lot. I miss a lot of my kids growing up, right? From the standpoint of, I couldn't get back from a trip in time to go to that daddy-daughter dance or whatever it may be. And so I think one of the pros is that when you have a business where you're involved in it, you're watching over it, you have that ability to do that. Now, it doesn't mean you may not work as hard, right? You're still working hard, but it's on your terms. So work-life balance is so important. And, the old cliche, you can't get back more time. It's our one finite asset. So bottom line is that we want to have some flexibility, and work-life balance is certainly a benefit. What would be another benefit of semi-absentee ownership?
Well, you kind of talk about work-life balance and stress together. I want to talk about another, which is time for other things. If you're a potential candidate, listen to this. Pete and I will both kind of walk through the fact that, you're going to take a manage the manager approach. You're going to deploy your experience, your skill set of leading teams and developing people. In that, you're going to create that work environment. In that, you're going to empower people and manage KPIs. So if you think about what you're doing in the corporate space to lead teams, which most of our candidates are really good at leading teams, or they wouldn't be where they are today, you could take the same approach. But what does that do? That allows you to think of other things. I think I signed my franchise agreement in March, and then I signed an employment agreement in April. And I took a parallel path to building 6-location franchise enterprise while helping a startup scale and grow. And, I had time for other ventures because I just did what I always do. I found a really good person and put her to work. And she handled the day-to-day stuff 90 days before we opened.
I think that's key, right? And so when we talk about semi-absentee ownership, you put a manager in place, you watch over that manager, and you always have to mind your business. But this idea is that if you can have somebody there, you're paying them $50,000, $60,000 to be driving the business. You're still overseeing them, and you can have another corporate gig where I'm making $300,000 a year. I've got all the benefits. That's just an easier way to launch a business, right? I got all my expenses covered at home, all that kind of stuff. There's less pressure. I find it to be a great way, but you got to put the right people in place and you got to lead those people. But if you can do that, that gives you the time to have other income sources and other ventures.
Yeah, and another side thing, which is happening a lot these days, we know the story of ageism. We've talked about that in the past. And in our discussions of ageism, we said there's nothing wrong with being underemployed. And when you think of being underemployed, yeah, cash flows benefits if that comes along with it. But it's also typically, like I had a CEO of a mortgage company that he started his franchise 3 months later, he took on a business building a lending team, which he had done 15 years ago and he could do in his sleep. And that's all he wanted because he wanted to do two things at once. So, there's an opportunity to really think for yourself and not for them as you take maybe a parallel path approach.
And I think when you're not involved in the business from the standpoint every day, every minute, you have less burnout. Right.
Absolutely.
So, right. And you still need to be minding your business, managing manager and stuff like that. You have a responsibility, but the deal is that it's not that grind, 10 hours a day, 5-6 days a week from that standpoint. So there are some benefits. Now, what are some of the cons when we talk about executive model semi-absentee? So you got a manager place, you're watching over that manager 15, 20 hours a week. What would be some cons to it?
Well, it's your approach. If you really hands-on control type, you might wrestle with the less control. Well, you really got to think of your ability to delegate and empower and trust. Sometimes people struggle with that, and some people might think that leads to missed opportunities for handling problems before they're actually established, or maybe missed opportunities to grab a piece of growth. But it's one of those things that come along with empowering people to do the job you've hired them to do the job for good reasons. So I say less control if that's important to you, may be a con in this one.
Well, I think it's the idea is if you're a micromanager, that's difficult.
Right.
It's difficult to, if you're one of those people, you have to, every decision, every second you want to make, then that would be a con to executive model semi-absentee, because you're putting a manager in place, you're paying them to handle a lot of that stuff.
Right.
And you still need to lead them. I think the other thing we've talked about before is that when you have a manager and you're not involved in the business every minute, you're building a less of a connection with the employees. Not to say that you have a bad relationship, but there's a little less connection there.
Right. I totally agree with that. But it's, you need to cast the shadow, and you need to let your shadow sit inside of business in whatever way it is going to be cast. If it's a work environment, it's the way you're handling employees, your attention to details. Sometimes you get a little distant, but never distant from the KPIs that drive the business.
And I guess that's another con to executive model semi-absentee is maybe you're going to have less consistent execution or inconsistent execution, however you want to say it, right? It just may not be as perfect as if you were there. And that's fine. You just have to understand that you got that other thing going and you have this franchise on the side, you get a manager. It just might not go as perfect as you would expect it because you're not there all the time.
Right. When you think of that, could you have less of an impact on profitability? Possibly. While you reduce your stress and you put together your skill set, you might miss an opportunity at time. But I was talking to someone about a lifestyle, and they were defining a lifestyle in dollars. And I said, okay, let's set the dollars aside. What else do you define from a lifestyle standpoint? For less dollars, what would you enjoy? And it's the things we've just been through. So if there's a limited profit impact in your executive model role where your hands off, that might be something that you could think about.
Well, and I think, if you can have a corporate job making $300,000 a year and you pay somebody $60,000 to be present at your business, that's a big win to me. I'm a big fan of that, as long as you just kind of understand that you're going to have to capitalize the business with more capital, right? As you're launching that business, you got to set aside that first year's worth of salary for that manager, just knowing that you're not going to be there. And that does impact your profitability. But the trade-off is if, again, you have other income sources, that's a fair trade in my mind.
Right.
So, Dave, as we talk about it, people say, how much time do you have to invest in a franchise business? And it really kind of comes down to what they want. Right. Do you want balance? Do you want to build a secondary income? Do you want to be engaged in the business full time and have more control and stuff like that? So there's no right answer, but it does take, whether it is executive model, full-time or semi-absentee, you still need to put time into your business, right? And if any message you get from this is that it does take time. If you're thinking you're investing in a business and you don't have to put any time into it and the dollars are going to magically come in and you're going to be successful, that's just not the case from that standpoint. They're not passive in any way. You need to be leading your business. And Dave, the fun part is that we get to help executives all the time explore franchise business opportunities, whether, the empowered franchisee or hire yourself, either one working with us. Our job is to get to know you, to get a good understanding of what you're looking for, what you'd want with the business, and then help go find franchises that align with your interest. And our service is free, but it's fun to help people and make a difference in their lives so they can choose the path and understand the pros and cons of each.
Absolutely, Pete. And it's a process. So I'd love anyone listening that wants to jump into this and have an exploratory discussion with either Pete and I, just reach out, book a 15-minute call with us, and we're ready to chat and see if it makes sense to work together.
With that, Dave, have an awesome day.
All right, Pete, you too. Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to the Escape and Empower podcast. We hope today's discussion has inspired you to consider franchise ownership as a path to leading life on your own terms. Start your journey towards financial freedom and flexibility. Connect with Dave at empoweredfranchisee.com or Pete at hireyourself.com. Until next time.